Hello everybody, so today I'm wearing a suit because there was something else going on today that gave me a cause to wear one. I'm not wearing a suit particularly for this video, especially seeing as this is just one of those standard Tuesday evening videos where I hopefully spend not too long going through a particular topical question. And today we're going to be looking at the topic of what would you do if your kid was trans? Now, this isn't a question that gets asked a huge amount. I have been asked it before, but it's not something that is asked all the time. However, I think it will be a good opportunity to, in talking about this, address, apart from anything else, some of the major ways that being trans-identified is dramatically different from being same-sex attracted. Because while, of course, the question of what if your kid was trans is not asked, like I say, a huge amount, it certainly is asked, but not a huge amount, the question of what would you do if your kid was gay is asked a lot of the time. It's a very common question for, particularly Christians or any kind of religious person, or indeed, particularly masculine people who might otherwise object to the idea of somebody being gay. The question becomes, well, what would you do if your son was gay? And not so much asked, what would you do if your daughter was a lesbian? So obviously I assume most people here don't need to worry about that question because I would assume that most people here are gay affirming. But the question is, what would we do? What would I do is obviously the only person I can really speak to, but like I say, I think there are some theoretical points here that will apply to other people as well. What would I do if I had a child and that child was trans-identified? That is the question. Now, the first thing I need to point out is that I don't think it's particularly likely that my child would be trans-identified. I think that if you are a gender-critical person, then your child is unlikely to develop the ideas that would lead to them becoming trans-identified. And what I mean by that is if you raise your kid right, this isn't going to happen. When I say right, I mean, first of all, one, not teaching them strict, rigid gender roles. Of course, if you teach your kid that girls and boys are supposed to be doing different things, then, you're being dramatically anti-feminist, and you are, in doing so, setting this kid up to think later on, well, hold on a minute, I do girl things, but I'm a boy. So I must actually secretly be a girl trapped inside a boy's body, right? A child, I would argue, is not going to start getting those ideas unless they are raised by parents with incredibly traditionalist notions of gender. And that's why, you look at a lot of trans-identified males, and they have stories about having very conservative parents, parents who perhaps were very homophobic, and therefore, these kids grew up with this idea of, I'm not behaving the way a man should be behaving or a boy should be behaving, so I must actually not be a boy or a man. And obviously I think a similar thing happens in the case of girls too, when you, of course, have tomboys who realize that they're not conforming to traditional femininity, and maybe you've raised that kid on a vision of femininity that's like princesses and all that kind of stuff, and if they don't identify with that, and if they think they're supposed to identify with that, I'm not one of those people who thinks you can't expose your children to traditional kind of gender roles in fairy tales and stuff like that, but if you do that, you have to of course make sure that you communicate to your kid that these things are not what makes somebody a woman, these things are not what makes somebody a man, it's just one way that people used to live, and still sometimes do. But obviously, I don't think you should deny the reality of history, which of course is filled with, gender stereotypes and things like that. You're going to have to expose your children to reality, which features lots of gender stereotypes, but you shouldn't raise your kid to believe that that's what makes them a boy or a girl, and indeed later on a man or woman. So with all of that said, I think if you, do all of that, and like I say, raise your kid right, you've significantly reduced the chances of your child coming, to you and saying, hey, actually, I'm transgender. In fact, I'm actually, I know that I'm a girl, but I'm actually a boy secretly. Now, the other part of raising your kids right is, of course, to tackle this nonsense directly, to teach your children the basic metaphysical principles that reality and rationality and the material world matter, to basically not have your children believe nonsense, basically to teach your children that this kind of postmodern nonsense is wrong. I'm not one of those people who thinks like that people can't educate their kids. You can educate your kids, and part of that means telling them things are right and things are wrong. Now, obviously, you can do that within the context of encouraging critical thinking, and you should, but I think there has to be a point at which, you do lay down a firm message of, let's be clear, you don't have to go out there and research to find out whether or not this stuff is wrong. It just obviously is. There aren't man essences and woman essences inside of people. The term man exists to describe biological males. The term woman exists to describe biological females. You can teach your kid that. And obviously, if you were too kind of crazy with it, like really just hammer it into them, maybe just out of rebellion, they would object to it. So obviously teach it to them based on the principle of this is just rational common sense. And, if your kid comes home and says, hey, there's somebody I met, and, as I think society marches onwards, it seems like this is going to become more of a possibility, depending on when exactly the kind of pendulum turns. Well, I don't know, pendulum sounds bad because it makes it sound like it will swing one way and then another way. Hopefully it will just swing the other way and then, that will be it. But basically when people start actually, acknowledging reality and things like that, I don't know when that's going to happen, but it could get worse before it gets better. And therefore it's quite likely that your child will come home and tell you some way in which they've been exposed to gender identity extremism. And within that context, of course, you're going to have to talk to your kid and say, hey, by the way, probably you should use the terms that you're supposed to use because you don't really want to get in trouble. I don't think you should turn your child into a crusader for your beliefs. Ultimately, I think that it's just a little kid. Just, let them kind of capitulate to the nonsense so that they can live a normal life. But just say to them, while you might do that, while, if you're told that a biological male identifies as a woman and therefore you have to refer to them by feminine pronouns, if you're told that, probably just do it because you don't want to get in trouble. But you should know that that doesn't really make any sense, and we don't believe in that. That's what I feel like you should say. And again, I think in doing that, you're basically making it so your kid's never going to turn around and go, actually, this thing which you've repeatedly told me and explained to me why it doesn't make sense in very rational and accessible terms, yeah, I've decided I believe in that. Sure, you get, I don't know, kids who come out, like people become flat earthers and stuff, people will believe nonsense. But I just, very firmly believe that if you are a gender critical person, then you probably know enough about this issue to argue against it, and you can just communicate that to your kids. And therefore, I just don't think that the children of gender critical parents are going to be trans-identified, depending on when the parents became gender critical. For example, in my case, people ask me this question, I'd say, genuinely, I am very confident that it's not going to happen. I'm not going to raise my kids to have very rigid understandings of masculinity and femininity. So there's no chance that they'll get this idea that because they're not behaving in a masculine way or a feminine way, that means they're not real women or whatever, or real men. And then obviously, if like I say, they're ever confronted with gender identity extremism and the ideology and rhetoric of gender identity extremism, I'll just say, yeah, by the way, I don't believe in that. I have nothing but love and compassion for the people who have bought into this ideology, but I think that they're wrong. I don't think that they have good arguments for their position. And I imagine that my kid would be pretty persuaded by that. And they would say, well, yeah, okay. Obviously I'd explain why I think they're wrong. But yeah, and I assume I'd like to think I'll have a pretty inquisitive kind of, intelligently minded kid, and they would ask all the questions that we need to ask, and of course I think I'd be able to give good answers to those questions. So it's just not something I think is very likely. Now at this point I imagine some people might be thinking, hold on a minute, how is this any different from somebody who thinks that their kid won't be gay? I'm saying I'm saying like, hey, you know what, my kid's not going to be trans-identified. And maybe some people think, well, how can you know that? Because, there are people who I'm sure think that their kid isn't going to be gay because they're going to raise their, kid as a real man. They're gonna be like, I'm gonna raise my boy as a real manly macho man, and he ain't gonna be no gay guy. They probably would use a worse word than gay, but I'm not going to. And I've actually kind of touched on this already, but I think it's worth restating. The big difference between the idea of like, raising kids gay and raising kids not gay versus raising kids trans-identified versus raising kids not trans-identified is that being gay is based on material reality. It relates to material reality, whereas being trans-identified doesn't. And this is really significant because like I said, I've made this point before, but let's suppose that you could raise your child in such a way that you convinced your child that he was gay. for example. You raise your kid and your kid was like, let's suppose that the evil, whatever people in school, they trick your child into thinking they're gay, which is of course a, conservative, paranoid notion. Well, if that happens, what's going to happen? Your child is going to face the material reality of, who biological men are, right? Like, eventually your child, who's been raised gay by the establishment, is going to be confronted with an actual man. And they're going to have to say to themselves, am I attracted to that person? And if they're not, well, first of all, if they are, then they're gay. There's no trick to it. They're just gay. But the point is, if they're not gay, then they're just going to say, oh, no thank you. Like, the point is, you can't trick somebody into thinking that they're gay, because eventually the material reality of what it means to be gay is going to confront that person, and they're going to have to be like, oh wait, turns out I'm not gay. Unless, of course, they've already embraced some kind of delusional notion where, sexuality isn't about sex. But assuming that, they're grounded in that material reality, you can't trick somebody into being gay. You can, if you want to, you can tell my kid about all of the gayness ever. That doesn't bother me, because guess what? At the end of the day, biological reality, right? Material reality. My kid is going to either be attracted to biological males or not. There is no tricking or convincing a kid to be gay. It just can't even be a thing that happens. Now, conversely, what about teaching a kid of this, about trans identity? Okay, so you teach this kid about trans identity and they, they do get, like I say, tricked. They believe in this trans identity stuff. Well, like I say, if they're gay, this isn't an issue. If they're tricked into being gay, this isn't an issue, because eventually material reality comes along and they say, oh wait, so being gay means attracted to, biological males. Well, I'm not attracted to biological males. There is no tricking that can happen, because material reality is, the arbiter here. But that's not true with trans identity, is it? There's no point at which, a child could be disabused of the ideological notion that being a man or woman has nothing to do with material reality by material reality itself, right? Because no material reality can challenge a belief that says that truth is not based in material reality. So essentially, that's why it's different. That's why it's indoctrination. That's why it's something which actually shouldn't be taught to children. Because there is no point at which a child can be shown that what they've been taught by, gender identity extremists at their school is false. Because ultimately they're being told, hey, it doesn't relate to material reality. And that's why actually the only thing you can do is say, is give them the argument for why, and this kind of shows why, you shouldn't remove the concept of material reality from your understanding of the world. You shouldn't remove material reality from how you are defining certain concepts. So basically, when I say that I know that my kid won't be trans-identified because of the kind of values that I will raise my kid with, I'm saying that because I know that material reality isn't the relevant thing here. The only thing that matters, it's pure ideology. If my kid believes in this ideology, then that will affect how they identify themselves. But if they don't, then there's no material. It's not as if suddenly my kid's going to be confronted with the reality of being trans, because there is no reality of being trans, right? Conversely, I mean, for example, if I raised my kid, if I said, I'm going to raise my kid not to be gay. I'm going to do, whatever it is apparently that I can do to make my kid not be gay, I'm going to do that. So I do all of that, and then my kid comes out, my kid, goes outside one day, sees a man in a Speedo and says, oh boy, that's what I'm into. The reality is that all of I'm going to raise my kid not to be gay is immediately undone when the kid is confronted with material reality of other biological males and says, oh yeah, I'm into that. That's the point. I literally, and I'm not saying that kind of conversion therapy when it comes to people being gay isn't a thing that happens. But That's talking about extreme levels of self-delusion. The point is that in terms of like raising a kid so that they won't be gay, well, guess what? The material reality of biological sex and like how that kid feels about males and females is going to be the determiner of whether or not they're gay, not the things that you teach them. However, conversely, with trans identity, it's the exact opposite. Material reality isn't going to be the determiner of whether or not your kid identifies as trans. The only thing that's going to determine it is the values that they're taught with, the values that they're inundated with. And that's not just ethical values, it's kind of intellectual values as well. Now, this kind of heads into the theoretical underpinnings of this question that I think are worth addressing. Because I think I've kind of made clear my point that I don't think you can say that being trans is something a kid is just born with, like an undeniable fact of material reality, as most people would argue for, being gay or lesbian or same-sex attracted in some way. However, I would also take this further and say that I don't think you can even really say that being trans is what a kid is, because again, if you're saying being trans is what a kid is, you're assuming that there is some objective referent for this thing. And I don't think you can say that, because when you're talking about being trans, you're talking about a theoretical abstraction. You're talking about gender identities and the idea that gender identities speak to some kind of man or woman essence. All of these ideas are metaphysically very spurious, and therefore to say, well, what would you do if your kid was trans? It's assuming, like I say, it's assuming the kind of substantiveness of being gay. For example, what would I do if my kid was gay? Well, the point is, I can't deny in that scenario that my kid is gay, right? Of course, if my kid is attracted to biological males, there is no theory there. It's just, that's material reality. However, if you say, what would you do if your kid is trans? Well, then you're making a theoretical assumption that all of the concepts around being trans are an actual thing, which is why, of course, the real question is, what would I do if my kid was identified as trans? If my kid came out and said, actually, I am trans. And the answer is, of course, I would address the theoretical claims that are underpinning that claim to being trans, to basically dispel the entire notion that being trans is an actual thing that can happen. The point I'm making here is that trans identity is an ideological belief. This isn't a question about, what would I do if my kid was, and then you insert something that just could be the case. My kid could be gay or lesbian or bisexual or whatever else. Certain kind of disabilities, for example, I had a neurodivergent kid. Well, those are all possibilities. But the question of what would I do if my kid was trans-identified, well, you're asking me, what would I do if my kid believed in a particular ideology? And that's the point I want to stress here. This is not equivalent to questions of same-sex attraction and things like that. This is a question about what if my kid believed in a particular ideology. And it's like asking me, what would I do if my kid, was really into the manosphere? Or if my kid was a fascist, if my kid was a socialist, a communist, a libertarian? You're asking me, what would I do if my kid had a series of beliefs that were, presumably different from my beliefs? You're asking me, what would I do if my kid believed in the idea that woman should not describe the material reality of being biologically female, but should instead describe simply the identity of being woman, the preference for being called a woman? That is purely an ideological debate. It's purely an ideological position. It's a position to be argued about and debated and discussed. Of course, it isn't anything like as much as it should be. It's not just something where I can say, okay, I guess that's what my kid is. Just my kid is a trans woman. No, my kid in this scenario, and again, I'm kind of assuming male, just because I have to pick, one or the other. I will get into the kind of the specifics of like trans identified male versus trans identified female kind of towards the end of the video. But yeah, I can't just say, my kid is a trans woman. No, I would say, okay, my kid believes a series of claims that are the foundation for this entire notion of a transgender identity being valid. And that leads quite neatly into, okay, so let's say, I've already said that I don't think it's likely that my kid would come to these conclusions. And I basically laid that out by saying, look, if you don't lay the ideological foundations for this, it's not going to happen. But let's say it did happen. Let's say that my kid still comes up to me and says, you know what? I'm I know I may be, let's switch around. I know I may be a biological female, but I am actually a boy. Let's say that happens. Well, even still, the point is, it's still an intellectual, ideological disagreement. So in some sense, the question here is, how do you want to handle kind of ideological disagreements from your kids? And to be honest, I think generally speaking, it's a parent's prerogative to encourage their kids to believe correct things. And for my part, if my kid disagreed with me on religion or politics, or indeed, the definition of man and woman, how those terms should be understood, in all of those cases, I would want to challenge them. And in particular, one question I would want to know, and of course it's the easiest question, in fact it is questions. Ask them questions. Say, why do you believe that? Why do you think that makes sense? Where are these ideas coming from? The easiest thing to do, is basically, and I'm not saying in a kind of accusatory way, but interrogate your kid in a kind of, friendly, open way. I know I'm saying, well, this is somebody who doesn't have kids. I'm not trying to make myself sound like some kind of authority. I'm not trying to present myself as the kind of person who goes, just have a reasonable, rational conversation with your kids, as you can do at any point in your life. No, I recognize sometimes it's going to be impossible to have reasonable, rational conversations with your kids, but I think it's also true that there are opportunities to have sincere, open, frank discussions with your kids. And let's say that opportunity arises and you're aware your kid has this idea. You have that discussion. You say, why do you think this? What is the basis for this? Why do you think it makes sense to say that you are, even though you're biologically female, that you are a man? What do you understand man to be? And of course, the reality is that I think that the answers you will get from your kid will probably be not very convincing, and you'll be able to show that. But I think there's also the possibility your kid will kind of say, well, I don't really know, it's just a feeling, whatever. And at that point, obviously, you kind of then need to say, well, here's why I think it doesn't make sense. And of course, within that context, okay, are you going to completely change your kid's mind? No. But this leads to another issue, which is, of course, that a very strong kind of basis for this proliferation of this ideology, basically, is the idea that everybody who opposes it is wicked and evil and hateful. So, within that context, a big variable is going to be what's your relationship with your kids like. If you have a very kind of fractious, I think that's a good term, relationship with your kids, then within that context, that's going to be one of the things that might set your kid up to spend all of their time on Discord and Reddit and things like that, and have a community because, their parents just don't understand them. So they want to get on there and they want to they want to talk to people. And that's when they hear these ideas and they say, oh, actually, I prefer what I'm hearing here. Everyone's valid and all that kind of stuff. So within that context, if your kids don't feel like they can connect to you, or let's say, again, talking about if my kids don't feel like they can connect to me, well, that might be one reason why they will actually buy into this idea of that the family they have on Discord that's all like some kind of, I don't know, autistic furry chat, who says, actually, you're probably just a boy trapped in a woman's body. Maybe that would happen, and obviously that's a thing that you kind of need to avoid. And part of that is you do need to lay the foundations down with your kid of a good relationship and an emotionally honest relationship where they feel like they don't need to go on Discord to be lied to by strangers and can actually just talk to their parents. Which again, of course, I don't want to sound naive. I recognize a lot of this stuff is almost certainly easier said than done. But anyway, with that said, assuming that you can present yourself as a reasonable, friendly, loving person to your kids, well, in that case, a very strong piece of ammunition that the kid might have, which is, oh, well, only evil, wicked people disagree with gender identity extremism, is now gone. They can't believe that. So basically, I do think that actually that's going to be a big part of disabusing your kid of this notion. Of course, the same way any kind of reactionary traditionalist belief is often no longer upheld once somebody recognizes that the people who disagree with them are actually very nice people. I know that Hollywood likes to do their whole thing about racial reconciliation stories, but I think there is some truth to those stories that basically, when two people realize, oh, actually, turns out this other person isn't that different from me, that's a basis for improved understanding and ultimately making the world a better place. So if you have a kid who recognizes, actually, my parent disagrees with me, but they clearly aren't hateful, they clearly aren't bigoted, I don't think that kid's going to be able to be convinced much longer by the gender identity extremists, because the only argument the gender identity extremists have is everyone who disagrees with us is evil and wicked and bigoted and hateful and murderous. As soon as your kid sees some reason to disagree with that, there's, I don't think that they can hold on to this ideology that much longer. So that's another thing, not just, intellectually engage with your kids, but if you kind of emotionally engage with your kids, then I don't think that they would buy into this idea that everybody who disagrees with them hates them. And therefore, I don't think that victim mentality would, as it does for the actual ideologues, kind of self-perpetuate until the point where they absolutely refuse to accept the idea that they could be wrong about anything. Now, the final point, obviously, in terms of talking to your kid, because again, that's the appropriate thing to do when you have this ideological disagreement, is to mention misogyny. And this is, of course, I think where the sex of your kid is a relevant factor here. If your kid is a girl, then what you'll want to do is talk about misogyny, talk about the fact, and I think, if you have a kid, you should talk to them about patriarchy and misogyny anyway, because I think that we are men and women is one of the biggest kind of lessons in a way that we get from being raised in this culture. And I don't think that's something which can be avoided. I think that the difference between men and women is sufficiently pervasive in our society that people need to recognize where they stand in relation to that. That's why I think it's important. I recognize I'm a man, I'm not a woman. Now, with that said, obviously part of that is you need to, if you want to talk about recognizing where you stand in that, you need to talk about the fact that women are victims of patriarchy and men are perpetuators of it. And I think that's a thing worth talking to your kids about. So, obviously I think regardless of anything, you should, kind of mention misogyny to a daughter, and obviously talk about all the, wonderful women who have taken a stance against misogyny and, try to get your daughter a female role model, aside from obviously her mother. So within that context, there's plenty of opportunity to get your daughter to associate with these, strong female role models and to understand the position of women when it comes to sexism. And with that said, I think you can very obviously make the case of, look, the reality is that women in a sexist society might come to have negative feelings about their own womanhood. And that is why so many women throughout history have taken a stand. I say stand. I'm not that posh. Have taken a stand to embody and kind of reproduce a more, well, I don't know if positive is the right word, because I think womanhood in general is positive, but more kind of accepted in society, more kind of empowering. That's the word I'm looking for. Got there eventually. Vision of womanhood. And that's the way to go about it. If, you don't just decide that you're not actually a woman, that you're actually a man, that doesn't make any sense. I think that's what you should just basically say to a daughter who thinks that she's actually a boy. You say, well, actually, what you're dealing with, feeling like you don't want to be a woman or a girl, is not unique to you. And this should also apply to non-binary as well, like stressing that this is not a unique thing, because of course that's the big thing with non-binary. It's like, hey, I decided that I have complex feelings about my, identity as a man or woman. That must mean I'm non-binary. It's like, no, everyone should, because of all the kind of the complex nonsense that's got muddied into the categories of man or woman. Everyone should have complex feelings about it. It's, not your place to say that you're not a man or woman just because you feel complicated about the fact that you are. So yeah, just in general, I think that would be the way to go. Now, if of course you're dealing with a son who has decided that they are a woman, I think that it would be appropriate to actually lay down the law, which is what you're doing, it is misogynistic. It's not okay. And obviously, I think it goes without saying that if you've got a son, you should, when it comes to things like, for example, consent and sexual ethics, you should, raise them with a mind towards the reality of how men perpetuate these things in a negative way and how they need to be part of not doing that. And I think in a similar way, you can say, what you would be doing in claiming that you're a woman is its entitlement. It is showing a serious lack of respect to women, that you are saying that you have the right to just call yourself a woman. I think it would be worth relating this to the reality of, you know, their own mother. That's certainly what I would want to do. If my kid came to me, my son came to me and said, hey dad, I've decided I'm a woman, I'd say, you know, your mum had to go through labor. She had to go through pregnancy and labor to conceive you. And to deny that experience for her is intensely relevant to the reality of her being a woman is complete nonsense and kind of ungrateful to just say like, hey, you know, I know you actually had this role in producing me, but I've decided that I'm a woman too just because I feel like it. You know, I don't know, depending on his age, if my son came to me and said he was a woman, I don't think I'd hold back in terms of saying like, what you're talking about, it is entitlement. It is basically misogyny. It's not a good look when it comes to, you know, your relationship to women and your understanding of women. But fortunately, I will again reiterate that I don't think that I will raise the kind of kid who would have these horrible negative attitudes towards women. So I don't think I'd ever have to have that conversation with my kids, thankfully. But yeah, personally, I think that with, like I say, a son, if it's got to a point where they're saying that they're a woman because they said so, something's gone seriously wrong in terms of their attitude towards women. And like I say, in terms of their respect for women, that they think that they can just say, actually, I'm a woman too. And I think that you need to, definitely come down quite hard on that. Now, I suppose the final question is, let's say all of this still didn't work. I think we're assuming a lot, but let's say that all of this still didn't work. Would I then disown my kid? And this is, of course, a question that gets asked relating to same-sex attraction. People say, hey, if you're a manly, masculine guy who's pretty homophobic, if your kid was gay, would you disown them? And of course you get something like, oh, no son of mine is going to be a pufter. Get out of here. Like that. I think pufter's fine. Or as Owen Jones would say, bum boy. Maybe some men would say that. But the point is, would I say that about my kid says that they are trans-identified? And I mean, it's kind of already implied that my opinions would be more negative towards a son of mine who had this attitude than a daughter of mine, because my attitude towards a daughter would be more sympathetic. However, ultimately, the answer is no, I'm not going to disown them, because I'm not the kind of person who's going to disown somebody over an intellectual disagreement. I mean, I'm a fan of free speech, I'm a fan of free expression, and within that context, and also I'm a fan of family. Like, I actually think, that family is an important tie, and that the family is a pretty decent institution. And no judgment to people who don't want to get married and have kids. But honestly, I'm a big fan of people doing that. Not least because, Christmas and stuff is awesome. If nothing else, I'm a fan of the family just in terms of how it kind of brings together communities and obviously can make certain, festivities more important, just as a little bit of enjoyment to life. So no, I'm a fan of family, and I'm not really into the whole, I think in very exceptional circumstances you can talk about disowning family. But just for a disagreement over ideology, no. And virtually no ideology I can think of. I'm not going to explicitly name anything because I feel like that would drive it home too much. But I'm just going to come out and say that I'm thinking of quite a few ideologies in my head right now, and most of them I wouldn't disown my kid over them. I would probably have plenty of intense, discussions about it, awkward discussions in whatever the British equivalent to Thanksgiving is. And who knows, maybe get disowned myself. But I personally wouldn't ever be like, well, because you disagree with me on this ideological point, I want nothing to do with you. So yeah, that's that. Just thought that was for the record. If you ever see me and I have a kid in the future, which is my intention at some point, then you can be assured that they almost certainly won't be trans-identified. I just don't think that's very likely to happen at all. If they are, then they will get a very frank discussion about it. And if they still stick to it, then I guess I still won't disown them. So now, this was kind of unspoken this whole time just because it's so obvious to me, but I'll just point out that there is a massive difference between gender nonconformity and being trans-identified. This whole time I've been talking about trans identity, which is the ideology. Gender nonconformity, got no problem with that. Like, and it's just like, that's the thing. It's kind of, from my perspective, it's just such an obvious thing that saying that you are a woman trapped in a man's body is totally different from being gender nonconforming. So, like, they literally, I can accept that they are related in terms of like how they'll often appear together, but from a theoretical perspective and an academic perspective or whatever else, they have nothing to do with each other. I'm a biological male and I like to wear a dress is nothing in any way equivalent to the statement I'm a biological male and I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. There is no equivalence between us. You know, one is a thing you like to do. The other thing is an ideological belief you have. They're just not the same thing. So I just thought it was worth stressing that. You know, now having said that, I do want to make kind of a broader video about the kind of relationship between gender nonconformity and gender identity, and that'll be a video that's some point in the future. Anyway, but as far as I'm concerned, yeah, I just think that's why I'm putting the focus entirely on gender identity, because that's the only thing that matters. Gender expression, it's not a relevant thing here. The question is, what would I do if my kid identified as transgender? And there we go. I think I basically laid it down. I'd be interested to know what people think. I get the impression, obviously, a lot of kind of gender critical women are actually women who are already of a certain age where they have had children and possibly they only really discovered, I think this is quite a common thing. A lot of women, it seems, they've only discovered being gender critical after their kids have already been raised quite substantially. So, you know, I think that's a relevant thing here. But yeah, I'd be interested to know what people think. And, you know, of the suit, of what I've said. And that's the end of the video. So I'll just say, please do like, share, comment, subscribe if you haven't. You can give on Patreon. I do appreciate the old Patreon. And apart from that, I'll just say thank you to my current patrons. In addition to the names scrolling past right now, I would like to give a special thanks to last month's patrons, Port, Clever, Jen, and Michelle. You're all very appreciated. Why does it hurt so much?